In the scorching heat of Camp Pendleton, under the unforgiving California sun, 500 elite soldiers stood at attention. They had gathered to witness what should have been a routine military ceremony. Instead, they were about to see something that would be talked about in military circles for decades to come. General Patricia Morrison had earned every star on her uniform through blood, sweat, and an iron will that had carried her through 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. At 45, she commanded respect not just because of her rank, but because she had proven herself in combat zones where lesser soldiers had crumbled. Her reputation preceded her wherever she went, a woman who never backed down from a fight, never compromised her principles, and never let anyone disrespect the uniform she wore with such pride. Staff Sergeant Jake Thunder Matthews thought he was untouchable. With his Navy SEAL trident gleaming on his chest and a cocky smirk that had gotten him out of more trouble than it had caused, he believed his elite training made him superior to everyone around him. He had completed the grueling Bud/S training, survived Hell Week, and carried out classified missions that would make Hollywood movies look like children's stories. In his mind, there wasn't a person alive who could challenge him. But on this sweltering Tuesday morning, 2 worlds were about to collide in a way that nobody could have predicted. What started as a simple disagreement about military protocol would escalate into a confrontation that would test everything both warriors believed about strength, honor, and respect. The 500 soldiers watching had no idea they were about to witness a lesson in humility that would be remembered long after the desert sands settled. This is the story of what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object, and how sometimes the biggest victories come in the most unexpected packages. The morning started like any other at Camp Pendleton, with the familiar sounds of reveille echoing across the vast military complex. But Staff Sergeant Jake Matthews was already awake, pumping iron in the base gym before most soldiers had even opened their eyes. The 42-year-old Navy SEAL had maintained the same routine for 15 years, up at 4:30, 2 hours of intense physical training, then a breakfast that could fuel a small army. Jake stood 6 feet 2 inches of pure muscle, with arms that looked like they could crush concrete, and a chest decorated with enough ribbons and medals to start his own military museum. The Navy SEAL trident on his uniform wasn't just a badge. It was his identity, his calling card, and in his mind, his license to be better than everyone around him. He had earned it through months of the most brutal training the military had to offer, and he never let anyone forget it. As he walked through the base that morning, younger soldiers stepped aside with a mixture of respect and intimidation. Jake's reputation preceded him everywhere he went. Stories of his missions circulated through the barracks like urban legends. How he had single-handedly taken out an entire terrorist cell in Syria. How he had survived behind enemy lines for 3 weeks with nothing but a knife in his training. How he had carried a wounded comrade 15 miles through hostile territory under heavy fire. But with great accomplishments came an ego that had grown to match his achievements. Jake had started to believe his own legend. He walked with the swagger of a man who had never met his equal, spoke with the authority of someone who had seen and done things that would break ordinary people, and treated everyone around him like they were playing soldier while he was the real deal. The trouble started during the morning briefing in Conference Room Alpha. Colonel Henderson, the base commander, was going over the day's schedule when he mentioned the special ceremony planned for 1100 hours. General Patricia Morrison would be arriving to present commendations to several outstanding soldiers, including 3 Marines who had shown exceptional bravery during their recent deployment to the Middle East. Jake shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening slightly. He had been overlooked for commendations before, despite his numerous successful missions. The politics of military recognition had always frustrated him. In his mind, he did the real work while others got the glory. He had risked his life countless times in operations so classified that he couldn't even tell his own family about them. Yet here he was watching Marines, get recognition for what he considered routine work. After the briefing, Jake cornered his buddy Tommy Rodriguez near the coffee station. Tommy was another SEAL, though younger and with considerably less attitude than his mentor. "Can you believe this?" Jake muttered, stirring his coffee aggressively. "They're giving out medals like candy to these jarheads while we're out there doing the real fighting." Tommy looked uncomfortable. "Come on, Jake. Those guys did good work. You read the report, they saved an entire village from being overrun." "So what?" Jake's voice rose slightly. "We do that before breakfast. The difference is we don't need a parade and a medal ceremony to feel good about ourselves." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Chief Peterson, a grizzled veteran who had served with distinction for over 25 years. Peterson had always been straight with Jake, which was both refreshing and irritating depending on Jake's mood. "Matthews," Peterson called out, "you're on security detail for the ceremony today. I want you and your team positioned around the perimeter." Jake's face darkened. Security detail? You want me to babysit some general while she hands out participation trophies? Peterson's eyes narrowed dangerously. I want you to do your job, Sergeant. And I'd suggest you check that attitude before it gets you in trouble. But Jake was already too far down the path of righteous indignation to turn back. My job is eliminating threats to national security, not playing dress-up for photo ops. The tension in the room was palpable as other soldiers began to take notice of the exchange. Peterson took a step closer to Jake, his voice dropping to a growl that had intimidated countless subordinates over the years. Your job is whatever I tell you it is. And right now, I'm telling you to get your gear and report to the ceremony grounds in 30 minutes. Are we clear? Jake stared at Peterson for a long moment, the muscle in his jaw working overtime. Finally, he nodded curtly. Crystal clear, Master Chief. As Peterson walked away, Jake turned back to Tommy, his frustration boiling over. This is exactly what I'm talking about. They've got us playing security guard while some desk jockey general comes to pin ribbons on people who've never seen real combat. Jake, man, you need to chill, Tommy warned. You don't know anything about General Morrison. Maybe show some respect for the rank if not the person. But Jake was past listening to reason. The combination of being passed over for recognition, assigned to what he considered menial duty, and his own inflated sense of importance had created a perfect storm of resentment. In his mind, he was being disrespected. And Jake Matthews didn't take disrespect from anyone. An hour later, Jake stood at his assigned position on the ceremony grounds, his rifle at the ready and his attitude at full boil. The 500 soldiers assembled for the ceremony represented multiple branches of the military: Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, and even some Coast Guard personnel who happened to be training at Pendleton. It was an impressive display of American military might, all gathered to honor their own. Jake watched with growing irritation as the preparations continued. A red carpet had been laid out, chairs arranged in perfect rows, and a small podium set up for the general's remarks. To Jake, it looked like a Hollywood production rather than a military function. Where he came from, heroes didn't need fanfare. They just did their jobs and moved on to the next mission. The helicopters appeared on the horizon at exactly 1100 hours, their rotors beating out a rhythm that Jake knew by heart. He had been extracted by helicopters more times than he could count, usually under circumstances far more dangerous than this peacetime ceremony. As the aircraft settled onto the landing zone, Jake caught his first glimpse of General Patricia Morrison. She emerged from the helicopter with the bearing of a true warrior. Even from a distance, Jake could see the confidence in her stride, the way she carried herself with the authority that came from years of command. She was smaller than he had expected, maybe 5'6", but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture perfect, and her eyes swept the assembled troops with the keen gaze of someone who had seen real combat. But instead of recognizing a kindred spirit, Jake saw only another obstacle to his own advancement, another general who had probably climbed the ranks through politics rather than pure skill. Another officer who would give speeches about sacrifice and service while having never experienced the raw terror and adrenaline of a real firefight. General Morrison approached the podium, and Jake noticed several things about her that contradicted his assumptions. Her hands bore small scars that spoke of manual work, not desk duty. Her eyes held the 1,000-yard stare that Jake recognized in his own mirror, the look of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. And when she moved, there was an economy of motion that suggested extensive combat training. Soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen, General Morrison began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled troops without the aid of a microphone. Today we gather not just to recognize individual acts of courage, but to celebrate the collective strength that makes our military the finest fighting force in the world. Here comes the standard motivational speech, he thought. He had heard variations of this same speech from dozens of officers over the years, and they all blended together into a meaningless stream of platitudes and empty phrases. But, as General Morrison continued, her words began to carry weight that surprised Jake. She spoke about the real cost of war, about the friends she had lost, about the weight of command when every decision could mean life or death for the soldiers under her care. She talked about missions that had gone wrong, about the guilt that came with survival when others didn't make it home, about the responsibility that every leader carried to be worthy of the trust placed in them. Despite himself, Jake found himself listening. This wasn't the typical political speech he had expected. General Morrison was speaking from experience, from the heart, and her words resonated with truths that Jake understood better than most. For a moment, he wondered if maybe he had misjudged her. Then she began calling forward the Marines who were to receive commendations, and Jake's resentment flared back to life. He watched as 3 young Marines marched forward with precision, their chests already decorated with ribbons that Jake felt he had earned 10 times over. The crowd applauded as General Morrison read their citations, detailing acts of heroism that, while certainly praiseworthy, seemed routine compared to some of Jake's classified missions. The 1st Marine, Corporal Williams, had distinguished himself by providing covering fire while his unit evacuated wounded civilians from a combat zone. Admirable, certainly, but Jake had done the same thing on at least 6 different occasions without receiving so much as a mention in his service record. The 2nd Marine, Lance Corporal Johnson, had risked his life to rescue a fellow Marine who had been wounded by an improvised explosive device. Again, heroic by any measure, but Jake remembered carrying 2 wounded SEALs through hostile territory for 12 hours straight without any backup or support. The 3rd Marine, Sergeant Davis, had led a successful raid on an enemy stronghold that resulted in the capture of valuable intelligence and several high-value targets. It was an impressive operation, but Jake had been part of raids that made this one look like a training exercise. As General Morrison pinned medals on each Marine, Jake's frustration reached a boiling point. Here he stood, relegated to security duty, while Marines were being celebrated for accomplishing what he considered basic SEAL work. The injustice of it burned in his chest like acid, and his grip tightened on his rifle as he struggled to maintain his composure. The ceremony continued with General Morrison delivering closing remarks about the importance of recognizing excellence and the debt that America owed to its servicemen and women. Jake barely heard the words over the roar of his own indignation. He had spent 15 years serving his country with distinction, completing missions that would never see the light of day, sacrificing his body and his peace of mind for the greater good. And what did he have to show for it? A security assignment and a front-row seat to watch lesser warriors receive the recognition he deserved. As the ceremony concluded and the troops began to disperse, Jake remained at his post, his mind racing with thoughts of injustice and wounded pride. He didn't notice General Morrison approaching his position until she was standing directly in front of him. "Sergeant Matthews," she said, reading his name tape with those sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "I understand you're a Navy SEAL." Jake straightened slightly, uncertain whether this was an opportunity or a trap. "Yes, ma'am. Team 6 for the past 8 years. General Morrison nodded approvingly. "Team 6 has quite a reputation. I've had the privilege of working with some of your colleagues on joint operations. Impressive warriors, every one of them." For a brief moment, Jake felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this general was different. Maybe she understood the value of elite special operations forces. Maybe she would recognize that he belonged with the decorated heroes rather than the security detail. "Thank you, ma'am," Jake replied, his voice carrying a hint of his usual confidence. "We pride ourselves on being the best. That's when everything went wrong." General Morrison's expression remained neutral, but Jake caught something in her eyes that he interpreted as condescension. Whether it was actually there or just a product of his own frustrated expectations, Jake would never be sure. But in that moment, 15 years of accumulated resentment, wounded pride, and inflated ego combined into a perfect storm of bad judgment. Must be nice to hand out medals for routine work while the real warriors do the heavy lifting, Jake said, his voice carrying just loud enough for several nearby soldiers to hear. The words hung in the air like a live grenade, and Jake immediately realized he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The silence that followed Jake's words was deafening. Around them, the dispersing soldiers had suddenly found reasons to slow their departure, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. General Morrison's expression didn't change immediately, but Jake could see something shift in her eyes. A hardening that suggested he had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. "I beg your pardon, Sergeant." General Morrison's voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Jake's rational mind screamed at him to apologize, to back down, to salvage what remained of his career. But his wounded pride had taken control, and wounded pride rarely listened to reason. Instead of retreating, he doubled down on his disrespect. "I said it must be nice to play politics while real operators do the actual fighting," Jake repeated, his voice stronger this time, fueled by 15 years of perceived slights and overlooked contributions. "Some of us have been putting our lives on the line in operations that these Marines couldn't even dream of, and we don't need ceremony and fanfare to validate our service." The crowd of soldiers had stopped pretending to leave. 500 pairs of eyes were now focused on the unfolding confrontation between the decorated SEAL and the general. Conversations ceased, equipment stopped clanking, and even the California wind seemed to hold its breath. General Morrison took a step closer to Jake, her posture remaining relaxed but her presence somehow becoming more imposing. At 5'6", she was dwarfed by Jake's 6'2" frame, but nobody watching would have described her as the smaller person in this confrontation. "Sergeant Matthews," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden quiet, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider your words and apologize for your disrespectful conduct toward these decorated Marines and toward this ceremony." Here was yet another officer trying to put him in his place, trying to make him back down from what he saw as a legitimate grievance. In his mind, he wasn't being disrespectful. He was speaking truth to power, standing up for all the unrecognized warriors who did the real work while others collected the glory. "With all due respect, General," Jake said, though his tone suggested he felt very little respect indeed, "I've spent 15 years as a Navy SEAL. I've completed over 100 missions in hostile territory. I've eliminated high-value targets, rescued hostages, and gathered intelligence that has saved countless American lives. And not once have I needed a medal ceremony to know my worth." The crowd was transfixed. Many of the soldiers had served under General Morrison's command, or knew her by reputation. They understood that Jake was walking into a minefield blindfolded, but none of them could look away from the impending explosion. General Morrison listened to Jake's rant without interruption, her expression remaining professionally neutral despite the blatant disrespect being shown, not just to her, but to the Marines she had just honored, and to the military ceremony itself. When Jake finished, she nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. "I see," she said finally. "So in your expert opinion, Sergeant, these Marines don't deserve recognition because their acts of heroism don't measure up to your classified missions?" "I'm saying that if we're going to recognize heroism, we should start with the people who are actually doing the hard work," Jake replied, his voice growing stronger as he convinced himself he was winning this verbal sparring match. "Not with Marines who got lucky once or twice." That was the moment General Morrison's professional composure cracked slightly. The insult to the Marines she had just honored was bad enough, but the implication that their heroism was mere luck crossed a line that even her considerable patience couldn't tolerate. "Sergeant Matthews," she said, her voice taking on an edge that made several nearby soldiers unconsciously step back, "those Marines you just dismissed as lucky have done something that apparently your extensive training never taught you. They've learned the difference between courage and arrogance." Jake's face reddened as he realized that General Morrison was now openly criticizing him in front of hundreds of soldiers. His reputation, his carefully cultivated image as an elite warrior, was being attacked by an officer who had probably never fired a shot in anger. The rational part of his mind had long since abandoned ship, leaving only wounded pride and ego to guide his responses. "Courage and arrogance?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "General, with respect, courage is what I showed when I spent 3 weeks behind enemy lines, with no backup and a broken radio. Courage is what I showed when I took out an entire terrorist cell armed with nothing but a knife in my bare hands. Courage is what I show every time I volunteer for missions that other people won't even consider." General Morrison studied Jake for a long moment, and something in her expression made several of the watching soldiers exchange concerned glances. Those who knew her well recognized the look. It was the same expression she had worn just before ordering her most decisive military actions. "You're absolutely right, Sergeant," she said, her voice returning to its earlier calm tone. "Those things do require courage. But you know what takes even more courage? Having the strength to show respect for your fellow warriors, even when your ego tells you that you're better than they are." Jake's jaw tightened. "My ego has nothing to do with this. This is about standards. This is about maintaining the distinction between elite warriors and regular soldiers." "Elite warriors," General Morrison repeated, and now there was definitely something dangerous in her tone. "Tell me, Sergeant, what makes a warrior elite? Is it the number of missions completed? The difficulty of the operations? The classification level of the briefings?" Jake sensed a trap, but was too committed to his position to back down now. "It's all of those things. It's the training, the selection process, the willingness to do what others can't or won't do." "I see." General Morrison began to pace slowly in front of Jake, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture that any experienced soldier would recognize as the calm before the storm. "And in your 15 years as an elite warrior, have you ever led men into combat?" Jake's confidence faltered slightly. His missions had been largely solo operations or small team insertions where leadership was shared among equals. "SEAL operations don't typically require traditional command structures, General. We work as a team." Have you ever been responsible for the lives of hundreds of soldiers? Morrison continued, her questions coming faster now. Have you ever had to make strategic decisions that would affect the outcome of an entire campaign? Have you ever had to write letters to the families of men and women who died under your command? Each question hit Jake like a physical blow. These weren't rhetorical questions. They were highlighting gaps in his experience that he had never considered significant until now. His missions, no matter how dangerous or classified, had been tactical in nature. He had never carried the weight of strategic command. Those aren't the measures of an elite warrior, Jake protested, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Aren't they? General Morrison stopped pacing and faced Jake directly. Let me tell you about elite warriors, Sergeant. An elite warrior is someone who understands that strength without wisdom is just brutality. An elite warrior knows that true courage sometimes means admitting when you're wrong. An elite warrior respects the service and sacrifice of others, even when it doesn't match their own experience. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Jake could feel the weight of their attention, and for the first time since this confrontation began, he started to realize that he might not emerge as the victor he had expected to be. But pride is a stubborn master, and Jake's pride had been fed by 15 years of successful missions and the admiration of his peers. He couldn't back down now, not in front of 500 soldiers who would spread the story of his humiliation across every military base in the country. That's a nice speech, General, Jake said, his voice taking on a mocking tone that made several senior NCOs in the crowd wince. But it sounds like something they teach in officer candidate school, not something learned in actual combat. The insult was clear and unmistakable. Jake was openly questioning General Morrison's combat experience, implying that her authority came from education rather than battlefield experience. It was the kind of disrespect that could end a career instantly, and everyone watching knew it. General Morrison's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted slightly. Those who had served under her in combat zones recognized the subtle adjustment. It was the same movement she made just before engaging the enemy. Officer candidate school, she repeated thoughtfully. Is that what you think, Sergeant? That my understanding of courage and leadership comes from textbooks? Jake nodded, convinced that he had finally found his opponent's weakness. I think a lot of officers mistake theory for experience, General. Combat is different from classroom exercises. General Morrison smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that made enemy combatants reconsider their life choices, and several of the watching soldiers unconsciously took another step back. You're absolutely right, Sergeant. Combat is very different from classroom exercises. It's messier, more unpredictable, and it requires split-second decisions that can mean the difference between life and death for the people under your command. Her voice remained calm, but there was an undertone that suggested dangerous currents beneath the surface. Would you like to know how I learned that lesson? Jake sensed that he was about to step into deeper water than he had intended, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. I'd be very interested to hear about your combat experience, General. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. Even Jake's buddy Tommy Regrez, who had been watching from the sidelines with growing horror, looked like he wanted to tackle his friend and drag him away from the confrontation. General Morrison nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision that she had been avoiding. Very well, Sergeant. Since you've made this a public discussion of qualifications and combat experience, let me share some of mine. She began to pace again, but this time her movement was different, more predatory, like a circling wolf. I enlisted as a private in the Army when I was 18 years old. I spent my first 2 years as a combat medic in Iraq, treating wounded soldiers under fire while mortars and rockets fell around our aid station. I learned about courage from watching 19-year-old kids hold pressure bandages on wounds that should have killed them while still trying to get back to their units. Jake's confidence began to waver as he realized that General Morrison wasn't reciting from a resume. She was sharing personal memories that carried the weight of genuine experience.
After my first deployment, I applied for Ranger School, Morrison continued.
I was one of only 3 women in my class, and the only one who graduated. I learned about elite warriors from instructors who had been fighting America's enemies since before I was born, and from classmates who would go on to lead some of the most dangerous missions in our military's history. The crowd was completely absorbed now. Many of them had heard rumors about General Morrison's background, but none had ever heard her speak about it so directly. I spent the next 8 years leading Rangers in Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other locations that I'm still not allowed to discuss publicly. I learned about tactical operations by planning and executing them, not by reading about them. I learned about the weight of command by carrying dead soldiers out of combat zones and writing letters to their families explaining why their sons and daughters weren't coming home. Each word hit Jake like a hammer blow. This wasn't the political officer he had assumed he was facing. This was a combat veteran with credentials that matched or exceeded his own. But General Morrison wasn't finished. During my third tour in Afghanistan, my ranger company was tasked with eliminating a high-value target in a heavily fortified compound. The mission required a night insertion, neutralization of enemy forces, and extraction of valuable intelligence. Sound familiar, Sergeant? Jake's mouth went dry. Morrison was describing the exact type of mission that he had built his reputation on. But she was speaking from the perspective of someone who had planned and led such operations rather than simply participating in them. The operation went sideways when we encountered twice the expected enemy resistance. We were pinned down for 14 hours, taking casualties and running low on ammunition. I had to make a decision: risk the lives of my entire company trying to complete the mission, or abort and accept the strategic consequences of failure. Morrison stopped pacing and faced Jake directly. What would you have done, Sergeant? What would an elite warrior do in that situation? Jake opened his mouth to respond, but found that he had no words. The question required him to think beyond his own survival and consider the broader implications of command decisions, something he had never had to do in his SEAL operations. I chose to complete the mission, Morrison continued. We lost 4 Rangers that night, but we eliminated the target and recovered intelligence that prevented a major terrorist attack on American soil. I received a Silver Star for that operation, but more importantly, I learned that elite warriors aren't defined by their individual achievements. They're defined by their willingness to sacrifice everything for something larger than themselves. The general's words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jake finally began to understand that he had walked into a fight with an opponent far more dangerous than he had imagined. The weight of General Morrison's words settled over the assembled soldiers like a heavy blanket. Jake could feel the shift in the crowd's attention, where moments before they had been watching a cocky SEAL challenge a general's authority. They were now witnessing a masterclass in leadership and combat experience. The dynamic of the confrontation had completely reversed, and Jake found himself fighting a battle he was no longer sure he could win. But pride dies hard, especially pride that has been fed by 15 years of elite training and successful missions. Instead of recognizing that he was outmatched and finding a graceful way to retreat, Jake doubled down on his position with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. "That's an impressive story, General," Jake said, his voice carrying a condescending tone that made several senior officers in the crowd exchange worried glances. "But leading Rangers is still conventional warfare. SEAL operations require a different kind of warrior, someone who can operate independently, make split-second life-or-death decisions without backup, and complete missions that others can't even attempt." The crowd seemed to collectively wince at Jake's continued defiance. Even his closest friends were now looking at him with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Tommy Rodriguez had actually covered his face with his hands, unable to watch his mentor's career self-destruct in real time. General Morrison listened to Jake's response with the patience of a seasoned predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When he finished, she nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words with genuine interest. "You're right, Sergeant," she said, her voice carrying an almost conversational tone. "SEAL operations do require independence and split-second decision-making. Those are valuable skills, and the men who possess them deserve recognition and respect." For a brief moment, Jake felt a flicker of hope. Maybe General Morrison was finally acknowledging his point. Maybe this confrontation could end with both of them maintaining their dignity. That hope died quickly as Morrison continued speaking. "But here's what I find interesting about your argument," she said, beginning to pace again with that predatory grace that had become increasingly pronounced. "You keep talking about what makes you special, what sets you apart from other warriors. You've mentioned your missions, your training, your elite status. But in all of your words, I haven't heard you say one thing about service." Jake's brow furrowed. "Service? General, everything I've done has been in service to my country." "Has it?" Morrison's question carried a sharp edge that cut through Jake's confidence like a blade. "Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like everything you've done has been in service to your own ego." The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow. Around him, 500 soldiers watched in fascination as one of their most decorated warriors was systematically dismantled by a general who seemed to understand him better than he understood himself. "That's not true," Jake protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I've risked my life for this country more times than I can count. And yet here you stand," Morrison said, her voice rising slightly for the first time since the confrontation began, "disrespecting 3 Marines who also risked their lives for this country, simply because their sacrifice doesn't match your own personal experience." Jake opened his mouth to respond but found himself struggling to form words. For the first time since this confrontation began, he was starting to see his behavior through someone else's eyes, and what he saw wasn't flattering. Morrison pressed her advantage with the tactical precision of a seasoned combat commander. Tell me, Sergeant, in all of your classified missions and elite operations, have you ever saved a village full of civilians like Corporal Williams did? Have you ever risked your life to rescue a wounded comrade like Lance Corporal Johnson? Have you ever led a successful operation that captured valuable intelligence like Sergeant Davis? Each question was like a scalpel, cutting away Jake's rationalizations and exposing the hollow core of his argument. The truth was that his missions, while dangerous and important, had been focused on elimination and intelligence gathering rather than the kind of life-saving heroics that the Marines had demonstrated. My missions were classified, Jake said weakly. I can't discuss the details. Morrison smiled that dangerous smile again. How convenient. Your heroics are too secret to discuss, but these Marines' heroics are somehow less impressive because they can be publicly acknowledged. The logic was devastating in its simplicity, and Jake could see his entire argument crumbling before his eyes. Worse, he could see the respect of 500 soldiers evaporating like morning dew under the desert sun. General, Jake started to speak but found himself at a loss for words. For the first time in 15 years, his legendary confidence had completely abandoned him. Let me tell you what I think happened here today, Sergeant, Morrison said, her voice returning to that calm, authoritative tone that had characterized most of their exchange. I think a highly trained, accomplished warrior let his pride and ego convince him that his service was more valuable than everyone else's. I think he forgot that we're all on the same team, fighting for the same cause, serving the same nation. Jake stood frozen, unable to respond as Morrison continued her systematic destruction of his position. I think he confused being elite with being superior, forgot that respect is earned through character as well as accomplishment, and allowed his personal grievances to override his better judgment. Each word hit Jake like a punch to the gut. The worst part was that he was beginning to realize that Morrison was right. His behavior had been driven by wounded pride and professional jealousy rather than any legitimate concern about military standards. But most importantly, Morrison said, stepping closer to Jake until she was well within his personal space, I think he forgot the most basic principle of military service, that we salute the rank, not the individual, and that respect flows both up and down the chain of command. The crowd was completely silent now, transfixed by the verbal dismantling they were witnessing. This wasn't just a confrontation between two warriors. It was a masterclass in leadership, respect, and the true meaning of military service. Jake tried one last desperate gambit to salvage his position. General, I'm a Navy SEAL, he said, as if his elite status alone should end the discussion. Morrison's response was swift and devastating. Yes, Sergeant, you are a Navy SEAL, and that makes your behavior today even more disappointing. SEALs are supposed to represent the best of our military, not just in terms of skills and training, but in terms of character and leadership. She took another step closer, and despite the fact that she was nearly 8 inches shorter than Jake, somehow managed to make him feel small. A true elite warrior would never disrespect fellow service members who had earned recognition through their own blood and sacrifice. Diag, a true elite warrior would understand that every soldier, marine, sailor, and airman who serves with honor deserves respect, regardless of their specific role or unit. Jake felt his knees begin to wobble slightly. The combination of Morrison's words, the crowd's attention, and his growing realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation was creating a perfect storm of stress and humiliation. A true elite warrior, Morrison continued, her voice now carrying the authority of absolute moral certainty, would have the courage to admit when he was wrong and the character to apologize for his mistakes. The challenge was clear and unmistakable. Morrison was giving Jake one final opportunity to salvage something from this disaster by acknowledging his error and making amends. It was more mercy than he deserved, and everyone present knew it. Jake looked around at the crowd of soldiers surrounding them. Some faces showed sympathy, others disgust, and still others simple fascination at witnessing such a complete reversal of fortune. But all of them were waiting to see what he would do next. The rational part of Jake's mind was screaming at him to take Morrison's offer, to apologize gracefully and try to rebuild his reputation over time. He had been outmaneuvered, outmatched, and thoroughly defeated in this verbal combat. The smart play was to surrender with dignity and tact. But pride is a poison that affects judgment, and Jake's pride had been so wounded by this public humiliation that it overrode every instinct for self-preservation he possessed. Instead of acknowledging Morrison's superior position and accepting defeat gracefully, he made one final, catastrophic error in judgment. I don't need to apologize for speaking the truth, Jake said, his voice shaking with emotion. "And I don't need lectures about respect from someone who's never done the kind of work I've done." The crowd's reaction was immediate and audible. Several soldiers actually gasped at Jake's continued defiance in the face of such overwhelming evidence of Morrison's combat credentials. Master Chief Peterson, who had been watching the exchange with growing alarm, actually started forward as if to physically intervene. But General Morrison stopped him with a slight gesture, her attention never wavering from Jake. When she spoke again, her voice carried a finality that suggested the conversation was about to reach its conclusion. "Very well, Sergeant Matthews," she said quietly. "If you truly believe that respect is something to be demanded rather than earned, and if you truly believe that your service gives you the right to disrespect others, then perhaps it's time for a practical demonstration of what real strength looks like." Jake's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about, General?" Morrison's smile returned, but this time it carried an edge that made several combat veterans in the crowd take involuntary steps backward. "You've questioned my combat experience, dismissed my authority, and insulted 3 decorated Marines. You've claimed that your training makes you superior to everyone around you. I think it's time to test that theory." The implication was clear, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine despite the California heat. But his wounded pride wouldn't let him back down, even now. "Are you challenging me to a fight, General?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. "I'm giving you exactly what you've been asking for since this conversation began," Morrison replied. "A chance to prove that your elite training makes you better than everyone else. A chance to show these 500 soldiers what real strength looks like." Jake looked around at the crowd, many of whom were now looking at him with open skepticism. His reputation as an elite warrior was already in tatters thanks to Morrison's verbal dismantling. Maybe a physical confrontation was his chance to salvage something from this disaster. "General, I don't want to hurt you," Jake said, trying to sound magnanimous while secretly relishing the opportunity to finally demonstrate his superior physical capabilities. Morrison laughed, and the sound was like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "Sergeant Matthews, I appreciate your concern, but I think you'll find that I'm not as fragile as you assume. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for decades to come." Jake, convinced that his size, strength, and elite training gave him an insurmountable advantage, threw a quick jab toward Morrison's midsection, not trying to seriously hurt her, but intending to demonstrate his superiority with a controlled display of force. He never saw what hit him. Morrison moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost supernatural. Her hand intercepted Jake's punch with casual ease, redirecting his momentum and using his own force against him. Before Jake could process what was happening, he found himself airborne, spinning through the desert air in a perfect arc that ended with him flat on his back in the sand, staring up at the blazing California sun. The impact drove the breath from his lungs and sent stars dancing across his vision. For a moment, he couldn't understand what had happened. 1 second he had been throwing what should have been an easy demonstrative punch, and the next he was lying on the ground with 500 soldiers staring down at him in stunned silence. Morrison stood over him, not even breathing hard, her uniform still perfectly pressed, despite having just thrown a 200-pound Navy SEAL through the air like a rag doll. "The throw you just experienced, Sergeant," she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than the physics of combat, "is called Seo Nage."
I learned it during my 2 years training with the Japanese Self-Defense Forces, where I earned a second-degree black belt in judo.
Jake struggled to sit up, his head still spinning from the impact and the complete reversal of his expectations. He had thrown thousands of punches in training and combat, but none of them had ever been countered so effortlessly. "I also hold black belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Krav Maga," Morrison continued, her voice carrying easily across the silent crowd. "I learned the first during a 6-month exchange program with Israeli Special Forces, and the second from a former UFC fighter who now trains military personnel in hand-to-hand combat." As Jake's vision cleared, he found himself looking up at a woman who had just demonstrated that every assumption he had made about her was not only wrong but laughably so. The desk jockey general he had dismissed was actually a trained killer with credentials that matched or exceeded his own. But, more importantly, Morrison said, extending a hand to help Jake to his feet, "I learned something that your elite training apparently never taught you, that true strength isn't about proving you're better than everyone else. It's about lifting others up, showing respect for your fellow warriors, and understanding that we're all stronger when we work together." Jake stared at her extended hand for a long moment, his mind reeling from the complete collapse of his worldview. Everything he had believed about himself, about his superiority, about his elite status, had been shattered in the span of 30 seconds. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached up and grasped Morrison's hand, allowing her to pull him to his feet. As he stood, brushing sand from his uniform, he could feel the weight of 500 pairs of eyes watching his every move. "Sergeant Matthews," Morrison said quietly, her voice now carrying genuine compassion rather than the steel it had held during their verbal sparring. "You are an accomplished warrior with an impressive service record. But accomplishment without humility is just arrogance, and arrogance makes us all weaker." Jake looked around at the crowd of soldiers, many of whom were now looking at him with something approaching pity. His legendary reputation had been destroyed in full view of 500 witnesses, and there was no coming back from this kind of public humiliation. Jake started to speak but found that he had no words adequate to the situation. "How do you apologize for 15 years of arrogance? How do you acknowledge that everything you thought you knew about yourself was wrong?" Morrison seemed to understand his struggle. "Sergeant," she said gently, "real elite warriors know how to learn from their mistakes. They know how to grow from defeat." "The question is, what kind of warrior do you want to be going forward?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Jake looked directly into Morrison's eyes and saw not an enemy to be defeated, but a fellow warrior offering him a chance at redemption. It was more than he deserved, and definitely more than he had shown the Marines he had insulted. "I want to be better," Jake said quietly, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. "I want to be the kind of warrior who deserves the uniform he wears." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's a good start, Sergeant. But wanting to be better and actually becoming better are two different things. The real work starts now." She turned to address the crowd of soldiers who had witnessed the entire confrontation. "What you've seen here today is a reminder that none of us are perfect. We all have room to grow, room to improve, and room to become better versions of ourselves. The measure of a warrior isn't whether they fall, it's whether they get back up and learn from the experience." The crowd began to disperse, soldiers returning to their duties and responsibilities, but many of them paused to speak with the 3 Marines who had been honored at the ceremony. Jake noticed that several SEALs from his own unit stopped to congratulate Corporal Williams, Lance Corporal Johnson, and Sergeant Davis on their commendations. As the crowd thinned, Jake found himself standing alone with General Morrison, the weight of his actions settling over him like a heavy cloak. He had begun this day as one of the most respected warriors on the base, and ended it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked pride. "General," Jake said finally, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and emotion, "I owe you an apology. And I owe those Marines an apology. And I owe everyone who witnessed my behavior today an apology." Morrison studied him for a moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. "Apologies are important, Sergeant, but actions matter more than words. The real question is, what are you going to do differently going forward?" Jake thought about the question for a long moment, considering not just his behavior today, but the pattern of arrogance and entitlement that had led him to this moment. "I'm going to start by remembering that being a SEAL doesn't make me better than other warriors," he said slowly. "It just makes me different. And I'm going to try to honor the training and opportunities I've been given by using them to serve something bigger than my own ego." "That's exactly the right answer, Sergeant, and I'm going to hold you to it." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Jake one final time. "One more thing, Sergeant Matthews. The next time you're tempted to assume that someone hasn't earned their position or their respect, remember that every warrior has a story. And sometimes the most impressive stories are the ones that are never told in public." With that, General Patricia Morrison walked away, leaving Jake standing alone in the desert sand, with 500 witnesses to his humiliation. And, perhaps more importantly, to his first step toward becoming the warrior he had always claimed to be. As the sun began to set over Camp Pendleton, Jake Matthews faced the most difficult mission of his career, rebuilding his reputation, earning back the respect of his peers, and learning to serve with the humility that true elite warriors understood as their greatest strength. The story would be told and retold in military circles for years to come, but its most important audience was Jake himself. For the first time in 15 years, he had been forced to confront the difference between being elite and being superior, between earning respect and demanding it, between serving his country and serving his own ego. The lessons were hard, the humiliation complete, but the opportunity for redemption was real. Whether Jake would take advantage of that opportunity remained to be seen. But one thing was certain, He would never again make the mistake of underestimating a fellow warrior, regardless of their rank, their size, or their appearance. General Morrison had taught him that true strength comes not from proving you're better than others, but from lifting others up. It was a lesson that would serve him well if he was wise enough to embrace it. I'm a Navy SEAL. General struck her before 500 troops. Moments later, he was knocked unconscious.